Well, hello, everybody. It's fantastic to have so many of you signed up for this webinar. I think we've already got well over 70 participants and over 100 signed up. So that's absolutely fantastic. We're also streaming this webinar on YouTube, and the film link will be available afterwards. A big welcome to each and every one of you, wherever you are. So the topic of this event is values, science and rights. What do they mean for dementia and COVID? A very timely and important question, given that so many people with dementia have died during the pandemic. So many have had their rights curtailed, and so many more are waiting in limbo for a diagnosis and support. So I'm really looking forward, as I'm sure you are, to some fantastic presentations from some very well-respected speakers. A few housekeeping points. Me here will be doing tech support. Everyone will be on mute, but please contact VBP admin, me here on the chat, if you have any tech problems or need help. Just a reminder that this event is being filmed. And so if you are showing on the screen, we take that as your consent to be filmed and for that film to be shared publicly. Also, in terms of housekeeping, we're going to have a 10-minute break at 10 to 1. So that will give you time to recharge your batteries or grab a sandwich or get yourself a cuppa or whatever you need to do. We're also hoping for lots of comments and questions. Please submit them via the chat function on Zoom, or if you're watching on YouTube, please put them in the comments box and they will be transferred to me. We've got a very packed agenda, so I'd ask all our speakers to be fair to each other and stick to their allotted time. And without further ado, I'm now going to introduce Dr. Ashok Handa, who's the director of our host today, the Collaborating Centre, who's going to welcome us today.
Well, thank you, Philly, and so wonderful to have 82 of you already participating. I'm Ashok Handa. I'm actually a practicing vascular surgeon, but also from January, the director of the Collaborating Centre for Values-Based Practice, and we're delighted, Bill, my co-director, and I, in helping to host this. This is a really important topic. And really, and as Philly said, even more focus on it, given the enormous number of people who sadly died with the COVID pandemic, suffering from dementia, and many more that are getting worse as we speak because of the lack of contact with the family in the isolation. And so this is very timely and important. And the Collaborating Centre is now in its 6th year of running. We've had to adapt and have many more virtual webinars and seminars and conferences like this. But it's important, we think, for the work to carry on, where we understand what's important to the individual can be different, but it's important to take into account. And so we're really delighted to co-host this, and I'm really looking forward to what's an amazingly packed agenda with some fabulous speakers. And I would encourage you, as Philly has done, to use the chat function and for comments. And I'm really looking forward to it. And thank you. And I think I hand over to Keith.
Well, I'll hand back to me for a moment, Ashok.
Right.
Thank you. Thank you very much indeed for that lovely welcome. I just wanted to come back because I've been told that I forgot to say who I was. So classic error, and I'm very sorry about that. I'm Philly Hare. I'm one of the co-directors of Innovations in Dementia. We're a small not-for-profit organisation covering the whole of the UK. And our main role really is to enable people with dementia to have their voices heard and their rights recognised. So obviously this event today is of huge interest to us, and I'm so delighted that it's going to happen. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce you to our next speaker, Keith Oliver. Keith is known to many of you as a formidable campaigner. His presentation is entitled My Values, my rights, myself, the me in dementia. Keith is going to also be co-presenting with Danny Tingley, who's an assistant psychologist at Kent and Medway Partnership Trust. So over to you, Keith, and welcome.
Thank you so much, Philly. As Philly says, I live with Alzheimer's. I was diagnosed 10 years ago, before which I was a primary school head teacher and a local authority advisor, and doing a master's in leadership. And all that came to a close 10 years ago. And this new door opened up to me around being an Alzheimer's Society ambassador and envoy in Kent and Medway. And I'm genuinely delighted to be here today alongside some eminent friends and allies, and to be supported in co-presenting with Danny Tingley, who recently helped me in writing an introduction for Julian's excellent book on ethics and dementia. Not wishing to waste time further on introducing myself, there is plenty about me out there on the internet for those who are interested. I want to spend the time addressing the issue of the importance of values, science and rights through my lens as a person who is 10 years down this pathway. First and foremost, I see life through my own values, which are based upon fairness, honesty, truth, and social justice. I have marched as a student for this in the 70s, and then campaigned for it as a teacher, later advocating for it as a head and advisor in Kent, trying to implement the Blair government's vision of placing the child at the centre of the system, rather than fragmented services of education, health, social services, and the police. A good training ground for what's followed since I've taken up the baton of rights and values relating to dementia. Professionally and personally, my practice was and still is based upon my values, which in turn are intrinsically linked to my rights and those of others who share my world, either directly or indirectly. I value my family and my friends above everything else. And in valuing myself, I see myself as far more than what the neuropsychology tests revealed, placing me in the lowest 5th to 10th centile when I was assessed 10 years ago. And I knew full well what that meant. I value learning and intellect. I value knowledge, but far more, I value constructive attitudes and skills, many of which no cognitive test can measure. I've always used my values as the basis for any decision making, both in my former professional life, my current role in the dementia world, and throughout my personal interactions with others. My values are consistent and they will never change. What does from time to time change is my approach to seeing how those values can best achieve positive outcomes for me and for others with dementia. To do this, I always return to the 5 dementia statements, which, to remind you, are, could you bring them up please and get rid of me on the screen there? Thank you. I'm not going to read them to you because we're all capable of reading, but I do want to pick out some key words. I want to pick out the word we, because these statements relate to both parts of the dementia family, and also the word rights. Those 2 words appear in each of those 5 statements, which relate first of all to identity, then to care, community, carers, and research. And I'll leave that slide up throughout the rest of my presentation. I have glued these firmly into my diary, which in normal times I carry with me to remind me of the statements, and if appropriate, I bring them to the attention of others. Whilst I recognise these rights are unconditional, I fully also recognise that some rights come with responsibilities upon both the recipient and the person seeking to uphold those rights on our behalf. Allied to this comes expectations which, if unfulfilled, at least causes frustration, and at worst, all that Kitwood referred to as malignant social psychology. How often do those of us with dementia experience this? And of course, during these COVID times, we have experienced this and much worse. One value I hold dear is honesty and truth. How often do we seek this from those in power? And for me, these statements are only of use and value if embedded in law and policy under a legal lens. Then I become more optimistic and positive about their use. From 2018 to 2019, I thought we were moving forward and our rights were being better considered. I had, with the support of Philly and Rosemary, my wife, who is with me today, taken the rights of those with dementia to the United Nations CRPD in Geneva, alongside the outstanding deep document, Our Dementia, Our Rights. I commend that to you. This resulted in some government movement, and after a sensitive meeting with senior civil servants, where I encouraged them in a number of directions based upon the statements, some of which significantly contribute to success, e.g. the blue badge for people with dementia. Then my enthusiasm was further fueled when I was able to take the issue of our rights to the ADI World Dementia Conference in Chicago in 2018, where the statements and the UK were looked upon as an advance guard in this world campaign. Without any doubt, life since March 2020 has negatively impacted upon everything, not least of which these statements aspired towards. As we, that is the key word, and I mean we as a collective people affected by dementia, with a diagnosis or a family member, and professionals, and anyone who has any interest or engagement with dementia, move forward towards a new normal in 2021, we must see values in the way people are treated fairly and decently, upheld consistently, where the person and not the system or the process do really come first in the care of those affected by dementia. That is, I feel, the right of everyone with dementia, not just to expect this, but to see it happen. I'm going to close my piece and then hand over the baton to Danny by expressing my thoughts on our rights through the emotional medium of poetry, because I'm convinced that creativity contributes greatly to resilience. And I commend this book to you, Time and Place, Collected Poems, written by people with dementia during lockdown. And it is a fabulous feel-good read and available for $4.99 from Amazon. There's the plug. And all the money goes to Deep. All the profits go to Deep. The poem, Our Rights. Did we really take this opportunity to make the most of chances we had? Did we embrace the challenge more fully, to move from what we knew was bad? To aim for the brightest of stars, though happy to settle for the moon? To dance to the melodic tune? To dance to the melodic waltz, taking the baton to call the tune? A right to be seen, a right to be heard, a right to feel safe, a right to spread the word. Let us vision united we stand, with our backs pressed against the wall, our heads held high, undaunted, knowing we never will fall. The statements came at the right time, launched with a fanfare of hope, example of true collaboration to help us all better cope. A right to co-produce, a right to create, a right to go solo, a right not to frustrate. Let us now take full heed of the messages shared today to make tomorrow a sunnier one for all and keep the demon dementia at bay. Over to you, Danny.
Thanks, Keith. When Keith initially asked me to say a few words at this conference, I thought to myself, what could I possibly bring to a conference on rights and dementia? What on earth would I, as an assistant psychologist, be able to teach others? Upon thinking about it, I realised that there are many things that I could say, as fundamentally this conference is about people with dementia, people who I am surrounded by and learn so much from each day. I realised that actually the rights of people with dementia is something I discuss on a daily basis and something I try to enforce in every piece of work that I do within our trust. I specifically work with rights in mind with one of our service user groups. These empowered group members essentially advocate for those with dementia, to educate the public and to promote support and rights for those with dementia. From this service user group, I have an insight into the difficulties that they face on a daily basis. For example, with people expecting them to have a carer with them, despite the fact that they're living independently, or not being spoken directly to due to bringing that friend or relative to that appointment. Our service users essentially just want the right to the value-based practice of person-centred care, treating the individual rather than the dementia, and more importantly, seeing the person rather than the dementia. A story from one of our service users really touched me. She explained to me that she had decided to join a dementia group who were having a day trip out. Upon arriving at that day trip, she was asked, "Where is your carer?" She kindly explained that she does not need a carer and is still very independent. The lady hosting the group said to her, "Well, of course you need a carer. You have dementia. We cannot be expected to look after everyone." Her experience really shocked me. I was surprised that within the 21st century, her right to attend a day trip was being questioned due to a misunderstanding of a diagnostic label attached to her. A label which you cannot see and may not have picked up on through interacting with her, as she's still so competent and independent. Rights for people with dementia are even more challenged right now, with delays in assessment, scans, diagnosis and treatment, as our NHS is stretched during the current pandemic. There are additional difficulties in bringing people together to share experiences and to realise that they're not alone with this condition. The increasing use of video conferencing will leave some people with dementia without the access to these conversations, as they're not able to use the appropriate technology. I acknowledge that the awareness of rights for people with dementia are changing. It's amazing to see the developments through the Deep Network and having more of our service users on consultation boards with various companies. Examples of collaboratively working with people with dementia. And I'm super excited to see what the future holds for the rights of people with dementia. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Keith and Danny. Very thought-provoking, and what a powerful double act to kick off with. I loved your poem, Keith, and your story, Danny, about where is the carer is one that should make us all stop and think. So thank you both for starting us off. Our next speaker is Professor Julian Hughes, who is a consultant old age psychiatrist. I've got the words retired in brackets, but I'm not quite sure how retired you are actually, Julian, given that you're here. But you're also the co-author of the book, The Dementia Manifesto, Putting Values-Based Practice into Work. So over to you, Julian.
Thank you very much, Philly. Am I appearing? Can people hear me?
I can hear you.
Great.
Yeah.
And I can be seen, I guess.
Correct.
Great, thank you. So I'm going to do three things. One is just, first of all, to make sure I'm watching my time. So the three things are, in a way, to give a little bit more background to this whole webinar. The second thing is then to give three principles which sort of underpin or are part of values-based practice. So I'll do that fairly briefly. And then also to look at three other principles which form the basis of the manifesto that we're talking about in our book, the Dementia Manifesto. Prior to doing all of that, I mean, and as part of the introduction, I also just want to thank everybody involved in this webinar, particularly Matt and Miha, who are in the background doing all the technical work, Ashok and Bill for hosting this through the Collaborative Centre. I think I especially have to thank Bill. I always think of Bill as being the unmoved mover, both in terms of, Toby and me writing this book, but also in terms of my whole career, in as much as it's been to do with things like philosophy of psychiatry. So Bill's the unmoved mover, which is really a sort of medieval way of saying God. So to me, Bill is a form of deity. But I also must thank Keith and Danny. As it happens, Danny and I worked together by coincidence for a few months in Bath. And then by coincidence, she ended up working with Keith. So it's very nice to see that collaboration. And Keith and I have had a number of contacts over several years now, and it's always a great delight to hear him speaking. And in some ways, I think that what I'm going to do now is just drop a little bit of theory in behind some of those human life things that both Keith and Danny were referring to. Toby said he thought I ought to say something about how we got together and as part of the sort of background to all of this. And my interest in my career have been to do with philosophy of psychiatry, which Bill has inspired. Also mental health law, in particular the Mental Capacity Act. There may be somebody called Charlotte Emmett involved in this webinar from Northumbria, who's always kept me on the right tracks to do with the law. And then finally, just general issues to do with ethics and palliative care. And I'll touch on that a little bit later. So that was me with my kind of coming from a kind of medical background. And at some point, and I have no idea when it was, but at some point I met Toby, and we seem to have just known each other now for years and years. And I just can't remember when it was that we first met. It may have been around the time that the Mental Capacity Act was coming into being. But then I had a fair amount to do with him when he was doing such fantastic work at the Mental Health Foundation. And in particular, Keith and I were then on a panel which Toby put together looking at truth-telling and truth in the context of thinking about dementia. And then at about that time as well, we both met with Bill, and Bill encouraged us to think about writing a book together. And I suppose there were sort of two motivations to that. One was that we wanted to produce a manifesto, and we couldn't help being kind of influenced here by the thought of the Communist Manifesto. It's not a Trotskyite tome, our book. Nevertheless, you can find references to Karl Marx 4 times in the index and to Friedrich Engels twice. There is also a reference to Lenin once. And the reference to Lenin was to do with a booklet that he wrote in about 1901, which was called What is to be Done? And I think that's a kind of powerful question when we put it into the field of dementia. What is to be done? And applying that question very broadly, what is to be done at a sort of personal level, at a sort of social level, at a political level, and so forth. So I think that question, what is to be done, is very pertinent to what we're discussing today. The second motivating factor was that we just became very interested in values-based practice and how that can be applied to dementia, and actually seeing that values-based practice gives us some way into thinking about what is to be done. So if we're asking the question, what is to be done, one of the answers is, well, we need to apply values, and we need to apply values at all of those different levels that I've just been talking about, from the very personal to the social and communal. So I think that's about that from the point of view of introductions. There was one other obnoxious thing I wanted to say, which was to advertise our book, Dementia, the Dementia Manifesto, but really to say that if you want that book, you can get a 20% discount if you go to the CUP website and put in the discount code Dementia21. So it's Dementia21, all one word, and uppercase letters. So I promise that I won't advertise that any further. Anyway, so then I want to move on to thinking about 3 of the sort of principles behind values-based practice, which some of which Toby will talk about a little bit more in a bit more detail later on. So the first one I want to touch on is the Twofeet principle. So this is the idea that there are always values and facts. Facts and values are always involved in the decisions that we're making. And just to apply this to dementia, the thing I want to talk about in a way is the, well, I suppose I should sort of interrupt myself to say, that one thing sometimes people think about dementia is that it is a very factual thing. It's referred to as an organic disorder as opposed to a functional disorder. It's to do with the brain. It's a very kind of concrete thing. And but I want to push back against that and say, actually, it's not quite as solid as we might think, that actually there are lots of values even involved in the diagnosis of dementia. In one sense, that's an easy thing to kind of push, because you can say there are always values involved in the diagnosis of any condition. But I'm also thinking at a slightly deeper level, because whereas it might look as though there are very discrete things like Alzheimer's disease, vascular dementia, Lewy body dementia, and underpinning those, there are very definite kind of pathologies. So in Alzheimer's, we talk about plaques and tangles in the brain. The thing to recognize is that underneath that, biologically, there aren't nice, neat boxes. There's just a continuum from, on the one side, no plaques and tangles, to on the other side, millions and millions of plaques and tangles. And it's us, we impose the boxes on that kind of continuum. So that immediately points us towards the thought that actually where normal ends and, as it were, pathology begins is itself some sort of evaluative decision. And also, which box you're put in is an evaluative decision, because in fact, the people who have plaques and tangles probably also have some vascular change, and you can also have Lewy bodies and so on, even in some of the other conditions. And indeed, many of us who are over the age of, I don't know, 50, sitting here today, we probably do have plaques and tangles, even though we don't think we have dementia. So there are evaluative decisions involved in even at the level of diagnosis. The second thing I wanted to mention, the second kind of principle, is called the squeaky wheel principle. So this is the idea that values really come into play or become more obvious when things are going wrong in some way. And especially when there aren't many facts, then the values seem to be more important. And I think we see this throughout the course of dementia, or throughout the course of the sort of, for people who are living with dementia, at every single stage, there are both facts and values. I mentioned my interest in palliative care, and of course, at the end of life, there are all sorts of values, and there will be disputed values. So there may be members of staff, for instance, if we think about artificial food and hydration, there may be members of staff who want to go for technical fixes and using tubes and so forth. There may be some members of staff who don't want to do that, who think that hand feeding is much better. And similarly, the families might also have quite disparate views. Some families might think that they really want to keep dad alive at all costs, and other family members may think that, you know, enough's enough, let alone the person living with dementia who may or may not have been able to express their views about that. And in the time of COVID, of course, those values are even more challenged by what is possible and what is not possible, or what is deemed to be possible or not possible. And the final thing to do with these principles, to do with values-based practice, is thinking a little bit about science and values. So typically it's said that, or maybe it's thought that as science evolves and improves, therefore at that point the values become less important, whereas in fact it's the other way around. So in the context of dementia, if we think about biomarkers, especially neuroimaging, it's now possible to have a diagnosis, if you can call it a diagnosis, of non-dementia Alzheimer's disease. So you might be in your late 40s, early 50s, and it's possible for scientists now to look in your brain and say, yes, you've got lots of plaques and tangles, or certainly you've got a lot of amyloid. So there are neuroimaging techniques which show you the amyloid. So somebody might be able to say, well, you have Alzheimer's disease pathology in your brain, even though you're feeling completely cognitively intact and so forth. So that's an example of science and technology moving on and the ethical decisions becoming more difficult. So the third thing I wanted to do briefly was look at some of the key elements or principles that we've used in our Dementia Manifesto. I'm really only going to touch on 2 of these and then leave the third for Toby. So the first, we had 3 kind of slogans. The first slogan was dementia as humanity. So what we mean by this is that dementia tells us about our humanity. We said it was the unique touchstone for understanding disease and disability, because it tells us about all sorts of things. It tells us about thinking about dementia, tells us about self-identity, about selfhood and personhood. It tells us about aspects of the human condition, such as aging, and makes us think about our mortality. It makes us think about a person's place in society and how we live together as people and as families and as communities. And of course, again, this is sort of emphasized by the whole COVID pandemic. We, in a way, if we're thinking about dementia as humanity, you know, we remember that in the old days, people with dementia were often relegated to the back wards of the asylum, whereas nowadays, many of them have been, as it were, relegated to care homes. Now, COVID has opened a door on the care homes to some extent, but only so that we can think about infection, mortality rates, and so on. The quality of care for people with dementia does get a bit of a mention, but not as big a mention as it might have done. And it may well be that COVID forcing staff to think about infection control makes staff even more task orientated than they perhaps want to be, because they have to do certain jobs. They have to test people all the time to see if they have COVID and so forth. So dementia as humanity was our first principle. The second was, which I can be brief over, was to think about dementia as a disease and as a disability. So it's easy enough to think of it as a disease, perhaps, and we know that a biomedical approach to dementia is terribly important. We know that there are treatments which are only modestly effective, but nevertheless they are modestly effective in terms of combating the dementia itself. But also, even something biomedical such as a urine infection has a massive impact on a person with dementia. It really undermines their, especially if they become delirious, it undermines their dignity, because it undermines the way they have to be treated sometimes if they become very delirious, or the way they might be treated in any case. So we need the biomedical model, but we also need this sort of broader social and political model. And what we've seen already in listening to Keith, sorry, that's my memory for names upsetting me, but also in the work that Philly does, for instance, and we're about to hear from Jane, who is married to Chris. So we're about to hear from people who are activists. We have heard from people who are activists in terms of spreading the message about dementia at a kind of broader social and political level. And if we think about that phrase, dementia as a disease and a disability, the key word there is "and," that it is a disease, but it is a disability. And what we're trying to do is to bring those things together. I think that's more or less all I want to say. The third principle that I'm going to just highlight is to do with dementia in terms of values-based practice and rights, but that's something which Toby is going to pick up shortly. So I'll end there, but thank you very much.
Billy, you're on mute.
You were mute, Philly.
Okay, can you hear me now? Sorry about that. Thank you, Julian, very much for a very thought-provoking presentation, and thank you for highlighting how values imbue every decision that we make, even when we actually think that they're based on science. Now, we've actually set aside a little slot for questions, but we haven't got any questions yet. I think we're all spellbound just listening. So what I'm going to do, if it's all right with Jane, is invite you to go ahead now, Jane, and then we'll have a few minutes for questions before our break.
Sorry, I had the proverbial cat then.
Sorry.
I haven't taped it to the ceiling as I've seen on Facebook memes.
So while Jane is speaking, please type in your questions into the chat and your comments, and we'll look at them soon. Thanks, Jane. So I'd like to go ahead and introduce Jane Goodrick, wife of Chris Roberts, who is living with dementia, and, or should I say but, a very well-respected campaigner in your own right, Jane. Over to you.
Thank you. Well, you've led very nicely into my talk. Hello, my name is Jane Goodrick, and my husband, Chris Roberts, who's here beside me off screen, was diagnosed with mixed dementia 8 years ago in 2012. My mum also had dementia. She had small vessel disease, which was diagnosed in 2014. She came to live with us, but then she decided that actually, as a family, we decided that she would be better off living with us, so that as her dementia progressed, we would be in a position to support her more fully. But it was decided that actually she would be better off at home. She wanted to go home. So whilst on paper, she was going to be, for her own good, better off with us, in her own personal choice, her spirit, actually, she was miserable here at our house, even though we had everything in place, you know, kitchen, cooking, people. But she went back home to her house where she was independent. And she may not have managed her day-to-day living to the extent that she was able to before, but it was her choice. It was her choice to go and live back home in her house. And as a family, we supported her. And my two brothers, one from London, one from Manchester, we live in North Wales, they supported her to live there until she died on December the 27th last month. And she died at home in her own bed, well, the hospital bed, but that doesn't matter. Now, as Philly said, normally I would be usually joining Chris as a double act with a buy one, get one free couple of dementia. We come as a pair. But this last 12 months, it's had a real and tangible effect on Chris's dementia. And his dementia has been very much impacted by the enforced limitations. Now, Philly said that we're both campaigners. We used to be out, we would be going here, there and everywhere. Chris has spoken at the European Parliament on disability about dementia. Obviously, since his diagnosis, we've travelled all over doing this campaigning work, and then everything stopped, and we're now doing it from home. But the enforced isolation, the enforced restrictions of the last 12 months have definitely impacted Chris's dementia. So that's why he's no longer quite so confident to come and speak, because he knows his language has been compromised. He could still articulate very well, but not quite as quickly as he used to. And so it's his choice to not join us today. He's been very much impacted by the enforced limitations. But I'd also like to thank Keith for highlighting the we in the dementia statements and the importance of the inclusion of that word rights. Now, they came about because in 2017, it used to be what we call the I statements, and the statements that were previously formed were very much aspirational. I want to have a good death, or I will have a good death. And these to be aspirational, and not everyone does have a good death with or without dementia. And that's just one of the things that springs to mind. So the Alzheimer's Society scoped the UK to find out what people like us, what Chris and I, people like Keith and Rosemary, actually wanted from the new statements. And they came up with 5 themes where we were extremely fortunate to be invited into a group of 9 people, where these themes were discussed, where the comments of people living with dementia around the UK had come up. And in that group, we wrote the first, what became the 5 statements. We wrote the first iteration of those statements before they then went to the Dementia Action Alliance for ratification. And I believe Keith was at that consensus event. I think it was April 2017. Keith was at that event where the group of 9 had written these statements, and the whole of the Dementia Action Alliance ratified it. But why I tell you this was because it was my Chris who insisted that the word rights were included in these statements. Now, that did raise some conversation. And were these statements that we were writing ratified by law? Yes, they were. We had them all checked out. Eventually, the argument was accepted, and there wasn't too much dissent because everybody agreed, yes, rights are so important. And as I said earlier, we, Chris and I, come as a pair. We are a we, and the group agreed with the fact that we couldn't do it on our own. There were carers, former carers, and so the statements, whilst written with and for people with dementia, the we not only applies to Chris and I, but they apply to all of us. The we are the professionals that are involved in our care. The we are the peer support we get from other people in the same situation. And we had it checked, and those the dementia statements, the we have the right is enshrined in law. But it was quite difficult to know what to write for this webinar because we don't know what we don't know. And how can we? It's only when our rights are violated or taken away that all of a sudden we become cognizant of those rights. We don't actually know what the right to a home life is until we no longer have that, until that's changed in some major way. But by then it's usually too late. Now, Chris's mantra throughout our last 8 years is that knowledge is power. I reference here Francis Bacon. Knowledge is everything, and none of us know what we don't know. And it's only afterwards with that experience we find out what our rights were, and usually, as I've said, by then it's too late. And it's not just the human rights that were written in 1947. It's also our legislative rights. It's the right to a carer's assessment. It's the right to a needs assessment. It's the right to good medical care. It's the right to having your voice heard when you say, look, I think I've got a problem here, and not being fobbed off the fact that, well, you could have dementia, but go away till it gets worse. That is a violation of our right to medical treatment. And it's not all about the medical model. But what of COVID? Well, this year, the decisions have been led by the science. Every decision the government made, they say, has been led by science. And in the world of science, evidence is everything. Even if that evidence is scant, as we've seen this past 12 months, they've been producing the evidence almost as quickly as they've been acting upon it. But sometimes we really have to go with the gut. When we know something is wrong, but there's no evidence to prove that, does not mean that it's not that it's not wrong. And one of the biggest and less hidden but voiceless tragedies of this year has been for people living with dementia and their families, the enforced isolation. Now, Chris and I live at home. We have our adult children living with us. They've moved in and out during the last 12 months. One of them has moved home from Ireland. So we have an enforced isolation, but we are within our own family bubble. So we are not on our own lonely. Lots of people are. And the difficulty with dementia is the understanding of the rules. Now, the pandemic rules have probably violated so many conventions and rights for people with very relevant reasons why. But people with dementia may not have that capacity to reason with it. Chris has me every day to say, no, we'll do this, that, and the other, or that's not allowed. Or sometimes he might become very anxious about, no, I'm not allowed to do that. And I can explain, yes, you can, you are allowed for this, that, and the other reason. Not everybody with dementia has that. And sometimes you can have older couples where they both have dementia. And so imagine the distress and the anxiety. If my husband, who's not yet 60, is unable to come onto this webinar, part of it being his anxiety has increased so much. How much for those people that are not as aware of us, that do not have the knowledge that we have gained? But this has been apparent for the whole population, but it has impacted some far more than others. And particularly for people in later stages of dementia, this has been deathly for them. It has literally been deathly. I'm minded that people in care homes have been locked away for their own good, protected, deprived of their blood families, their outside families. This violates so many rights, and there are far more qualified people here that will be able to tell you exactly which rights were violated where. I don't know that. I just know in my gut that is not right. I don't say it's wrong because the reasons for that have come from very good intent. Sometimes that good intent is not good enough. Rights apply to us all and affect us all, but those rights are open to abuse, both by people and maintaining they have the right to do this, but also people imposing an abusive situation on someone else. The people with dementia also have a societal duty to comply with the rights that are accessible and applicable to all. So when the government says, wear a mask, unless there is another reason to wear a mask or a mental health reason, then they can very happily wear a mask. But it must not be used as a get out of jail free card. I have dementia, therefore I am not going to comply because. I mean, I've heard one gentleman say how he's argued with the security guard that he must go in the shop with his wife because he has dementia. And in the next webinar, I've heard him say, oh yes, I'm still out and about and able to go on my own. This is, whilst it's not seen as an abuse of rights, it is an abuse of privilege, if you like, an abuse of the disability rights that he's accessing in one moment and then not another. However, the difficulty with dementia is actually some days he may need to go in with his wife and some days he may be able to go on his own. And these are the great difficulties that we have, particularly where rights and rules are involved with dementia.
Thanks, Jane. Thank
you.
Oh,
sorry.
Can I just
one more?
One more, yeah.
So carers like me have been holding on, and we've been waiting for that chance to exhale. We've been waiting for the release of the enforced isolation so that we can exhale, to get some of that respite, because not everybody is like Chris and I. People are out there struggling. The people with dementia are struggling, but so too are their wives, their children, their social carers. It really is about all of us. It really is about the we in the dementia statements. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jane, and to your partner, Chris, in the background as well. That was great. And you've really brought the whole issue right into the human sphere. So thank you so much for that. Right, we've just got a few minutes for questions. Could I ask the speakers so far to please show themselves on video and to unmute in case you want to answer a question. We've got two questions. We might just have time for one, I'm not sure. We've got a great question from Sally Knocker. Hi, Sally, and thank you for your question. Sally says, could we focus more on dementia as a disability in core education on dementia? Using the word disability places the focus on environments and social psychology, takes it away from the problem, the neuropathology. So should we talk about dementia as a disability more? Please signal to me, guys, if you'd like to answer that question. Jane.
If I can start it off and hopefully spark from others. Dementia, if you are diagnosed early enough, yes, you have some kind of disability because you're presenting to the GP, to the memory service with symptoms, therefore something is not the same as before. But as far as the more advanced disability goes, it comes upon people with dementia much more slowly. It's not so obvious. The same example I gave as the gentleman going to the shop was completely within his rights to go with his wife, but the next day he may not have the disability he had the day before. And a lot of people with dementia and family members, we don't recognize it as a disability. And that's one of the points I was making before about knowledge is power. We need so much education about the words and the terms that are used. Nobody wants to be described as disabled if they don't feel disabled.
Thank you, Jane. We've just got time to take one more person. Julian, thank you.
I completely agree with what Jane just said. And I'm just going to, in a way, repeat something that I said before, which is that I think we still want to have this kind of biomedical understanding as well, because we are all embodied and we need to think about our bodies as well. But the whole business of disability and disability rights is just such a sort of powerful thing to think about in relation to people living with dementia. And I would commend people, and I'll put it up in the chat thing in a second, a paper by Tom Shakespeare and some of his colleagues, which was specifically about this. So Tom has a disability, and he was writing from that perspective, also he was writing with somebody who also had a mental health problem. But they were saying that, you know, look at what's been achieved by the disability rights kind of campaign, and surely dementia should be able to achieve similar sorts of things. So I think from Jane and Chris and Keith and you, Philly, you know, we've got people who are pushing this agenda, and we obviously need more of it. And sometimes I think it's difficult to think, what would it achieve? But if you think that once people with wheelchairs couldn't get off any pavement, and now every pavement has a ramp down for people with wheelchairs, we have to then think, well, what would something similar be for people with dementia? And the sort of ideas that are already kind of common, although not in COVID, is theatre, sort of plays being put on at times which are going to suit people with dementia, where they can go in the afternoon, where the lights can be left on, where there can be more gaps, where it's acceptable for people to leave and come back in, and so forth.
Thank you, Julian. Thank you very much. I'm going to leave it there because I think it's important that we do protect our 10 minutes break. And so I suggest that we all turn off our videos and mute ourselves. Please grab yourselves a cuppa, but don't go away far. And please be back for us to start again at 1 o'clock. Thank you so much.
Was that you dinging there, Philly? Was that a 1 o'clock bell ringing?
It wasn't me. It wasn't my bell, no. So, welcome back, everybody. Hope you've managed to grab a cuppa or just get a bit of fresh air. Our next speaker is Toby Williamson, independent consultant, and alongside Julian, his co-author of the Dementia Manifesto. Toby's going to be talking about value-based practice and a rights-based approach in dementia, and he's going to be talking about how this connects with COVID. So over to you, Toby.
Okay, thanks very much, Philly, and good afternoon, everyone. So I'm going to use some slides. I hope that you can see them. Obviously, being the last speaker, inevitably, many of the things that I plan to say have already been very articulately said by previous speakers. So in a way that makes it a little bit easier, but with a slight anxiety of seeing that sign coming up saying you've got your internet connection is unstable just at a crucial point. So I have lined Julian up to stand in should a disaster befall me, but let's hope that doesn't happen. So I just want to add my thanks really to all the speakers and Philly for chairing today, as well as everyone who's come along to listen and hopefully ask questions as well. And also obviously to our hosts at the Value-Based Practice Collaborating Centre, so that's much appreciated. Weirdly, I think I first met Julian at another online conference about values-based practice in about 2005, so there's some symmetry there. Quite what it tells us, I'm not so sure, but anyway, that was our first connection, I think. So could I have the next slide, please, from here? So Julian's already touched upon values-based practice, and this webinar is being hosted by the Collaborating Centre for Values-Based Practice. So I thought I'd just say a little bit more about what we mean by values-based practice firstly. And we've already heard examples of values. Keith described the values that are important to him. And when we talk about values in terms of values-based practice, we're not just saying, no, those lists of values that may be on an A4 piece of paper and laminated and stuck up on the wall of an office, or the corporate values in an organisation. You can see from this list that values are living things. They're things that people hold close and dear to them. They're important things about guiding our actions, guiding what we do. And everybody has values, ranging from people living with dementia, family carers, through to practitioners, their professional values, but also sometimes their personal values may come into play. Organisational values in terms of policies and procedures of NHS trusts and local authorities. Wider societal values expressed through the media and public attitudes, particularly about dementia. And values expressed in law, and I'll come back to that in a minute. But of course that means there's an enormous range of values that may be at play, as it were, in any situation when supporting a person with dementia. They may not be consistent. There may be a conflict of values sometimes, and that can be distressing for people involved. It can be problematic in providing support or knowing what kind of support to provide, particularly when the evidence or the science is somewhat limited in guiding us what to do. Now, I put an asterisk there by values expressed in law, because I think, and I'll come back to this point in a minute, because where values are expressed through law, they perhaps have a slightly different status than values expressed elsewhere. And I'll explain what I mean by that in a minute. Next slide, please. And in dementia and dementia care, supporting people with dementia, we find values everywhere. Now, Julian mentioned about using science and using evidence to guide us wherever possible. Evidence-based practice is that phrase that's often used to guide us in terms of decisions about care and support, treatment. But for those of you who are very familiar with dementia, we know that the evidence around treatment, for example, is very limited. There are very limited interventions that work particularly well. There's no cure for dementia. So that means decision-making, decisions about issues such as risk and care and treatment, inevitably values come in and guide many of our decisions, because we lack facts, we lack science. We're not led by the science a lot of the time, or not by a traditional definition of science, perhaps as people understand it. We're led by what seems to be important. We're hopefully led by the wishes and views of the person with dementia, family carers, but also professional views, the views of other people supporting someone with dementia. And I think, looking at that list, I think you can see where values come into play in many of those situations. I'll just select one because it's something that many people who know me know that it's something that's particular interest to me around truth-telling. And so when someone with dementia, perhaps with more severe dementia, is asking to see someone, perhaps a husband or wife, partner, spouse who's now deceased, but the person believes they're still alive, or they live in a care home and they're expressing that wish to go home, although they no longer have a home, their home is the care home, or perhaps they want to see an adult child, believing that adult child to be a baby, so saying, where's my baby, where's my baby? And this is an effect of dementia. It's very meaningful to the person, but the kind of evidence that we have indicates that quite often, not telling the truth to that person, not telling that person that their husband is no longer alive, that not telling the truth is a better way of supporting them than constantly to tell them something which is distressing and they may not be able to remember, so results in repetitive grieving, i.e., I'm very sorry your husband died many years ago. And that can be a very distressing thing for someone with dementia to hear. But now you can see where I'm going with this. If we're therefore saying not telling the truth has some evidence base to it, that raises enormous issues about values, because some people will say, well, does that mean you're condoning lying to a person with dementia? I've always taught to be honest, and so on. So immediately one can see that even if there's an evidence base, and there is, for example, with something called doll therapy, where it's sometimes appropriate to provide someone with a doll instead of a baby, and they believe that they're holding a baby, or may believe it's holding a doll, but it provides comfort. But clearly that's not a truth that's being told to that person, but there's an evidence to support, indicate that alleviates distress. But many people would say, should we go there? Because that's a value that seems to condone lying. So I'll just leave that one with you, and I'll probably come back to it a little later, because it's a particularly acute example. Could I have the next slide, please? So the values-based practice has these two key elements. A premise, the basis of values-based practice, is about a mutual respect for differences of values. It's saying, let's not try and say we've got to all agree one set of values. Yes, of course, we can say dignity and respect are important, or fairness and so on, but we also have to acknowledge that people have different values. Some people will value their independence much over, say, safety. Some people may not hold truth-telling as the be-all and end-all of virtues, and may be perhaps a little bit more flexible around how one should respond in those situations I've described. So there has to be this mutual respect for why differences in values. And therefore, when we're making decisions, and when I say we, that's involving the person with dementia, family carers and practitioners, we're making decisions within a framework of shared values. And by shared, I don't necessarily mean shared in as much as we all agree with them, but shared in terms of we recognise there's a whole range of values in play. I heard quite a nice phrase, I think Bill first used it, around think of values as action guiding words rather than its dignity or morality, but they just are things that are important to them and guide our actions. Another good way of understanding values in the context of values-based practice is in terms of thinking of it like an extended family. They're all related, but they don't necessarily all get on with each other. So there will be arguments and disputes, but we are all one big family. So think of values in that way. So go to the next slide, please. So values-based practice doesn't try and say these are the right values and these are the wrong values, because often all the values are right from the perspective of the person or the organisation that's holding them. There are some exceptions where values, I suppose, are expressed, such as through racism, are very oppressive to other people. There are some boundaries, but broadly speaking, there are no right and wrong values. It's about understanding the different values that, as I say, are in play in a different situation. So values-based practice doesn't say here are the answers to often very difficult dilemmas in, say, dementia care, but values-based practice offers a process to good decision making. And there are 10 elements to this process, and you can see them there described, outlined on the screen. And I'm not going to cover them all. Julian's already talked about 3 practitioner skills. I think are self-explanatory in terms of being aware, understanding, knowing about values. But just to go back to that example of truth-telling, so in that bottom left-hand corner that says relationships. So if the person with dementia has very strong religious convictions about always telling the truth, as do their family, then it may be that one does have to tell the truth, at least initially, to someone, say, about a deceased relative no longer being alive, and deal with the distress that causes. But where someone perhaps hasn't got such a strong value or known to have such a strong value around truth-telling, perhaps there is more flexibility around that. And that's where one has to understand the person, family carers. So you start off with the values of the person with dementia, but you also take into account the values of others, including practitioners. And that partnership statement, dissensus is okay. This doesn't mean that disagreement is okay or conflict is okay. It just means that we can risk having different points of view, providing we respect other points of view, and we say, well, let's try this approach first based upon what you think to be important. If that works, all well and good. But if that doesn't work, then maybe we try a different approach, using the evidence or science where we can, but based upon other people's values, and see if that works instead. So dissensus is an inclusive statement. It's not there to describe disagreements or conflict. And you can see how that could play out with, say, the example of truth-telling, if you can negotiate well and positively with everybody involved. Okay, so that's a whistle-stop tour through values-based practice. If we could have the next slide, please. I'll just try and just finish up. Oh, sorry, no, there's one more thing I want to add, and this really builds upon what's already been said about rights. There are those 10 statements around good process and values-based practice, but when we were writing Dementia Manifesto, we felt we were writing at a time when actually there'd been a real explosion of new legal frameworks over the previous 15 years, which practitioners, people with dementia, family carers, increasingly were aware of and should inform practice, often in very helpful ways, but if you don't understand the law, it can be a scary thing. So we felt, we suggested having an 11th pointer for values-based practice decision-making, which is about values-based practice working in partnership with a rights-based approach. So taking into account things like Mental Capacity Act, Care Act, Human Rights Act, etc. And that's because if you don't follow the law, there are potentially quite concrete and negative results if you get it wrong. So I'm not saying the law is the be-all and end-all, but in some ways it's the thing that people gives real focus. So the values expressed through the law are sometimes are things that people really do have to be aware of in their practice and in their lives. But, and pardon the expression there for given recent political events, but although legal values trump other values, they may not always be consistent. So we still need values-based practice to help us work out those inconsistencies. For example, there's inconsistencies between the Mental Capacity Act and the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. There are inconsistencies in human rights legislation as well. So we still need values-based practice to help us weigh up and work out what the best thing is to do, even when we have the law around us. So next slide, please. I'm conscious that I'm out of time. I just want to say a few sort of final words about COVID, dementia, science and values. Now, as people have said, I mean, COVID's had a very detrimental and terrible effect on many people, but particularly people with dementia. Older people and people with dementia are at considerable risk from developing COVID and dying of COVID. I suppose it's just worth saying, and I'm trying to be balanced here, is that when you apply science and values over what's happened over the last year, you could put an argument forward. I think it's reasonable to say people with dementia benefited in some respects. We've seen unprecedented population-wide public health protection measures, which I suppose in many respects have been designed to protect the most vulnerable, and that includes people with dementia. So that's unusual in my lifetime. I've never seen anything like it. The speed to create vaccines and improve treatment for COVID has been unprecedented. And clearly, again, the prioritisation around older people and people in care homes receiving the vaccine, again, that in some ways will benefit older people with dementia. And this is perhaps, I was trying to be particularly fair here when I was thinking about the list of extremely clinically vulnerable conditions, which still doesn't name dementia. And being kind, I'm not sure whether this was the thinking at the Department of Health when they put the list together, but perhaps it's trying to be person-centred and recognising that many people with dementia can make decisions, can understand COVID, can make decisions about precautions and their social distancing. So why should they all be lumped together as being extremely clinically vulnerable in one big group? So as I say, I was trying to be kind there to DHSC. But if I could have the next slide, please. When you apply science and values in other ways, one certainly can say, well, dementia has been the most common pre-morbid condition, the illness that is most common that people have had prior to developing COVID and dying of COVID. So you're at greatest risk of dying of COVID if you have dementia, yet it's still not listed as an extremely clinically vulnerable condition. And I don't know if any member of the audience can suggest why it's not listed there. Now, there's 6 forms of cancer, there's asthma, there's cystic fibrosis, there's Down syndrome, which I think was added later, and some, quote unquote, some rare diseases. Why isn't dementia there? I just don't know. I don't understand. So there's that fact to take into account. And then, how come we can develop these health interventions so quickly for COVID, but still we don't seem to have effective treatments for dementia, which has been around for much longer? And what does that say about the values around different diseases and our responses to different diseases? Of course, dementia is a very different disease from COVID, but nevertheless, the science seems to be lagging behind in terms of what we've been able to achieve with COVID. And then there's all the responses that we've seen around isolation, bans on care home visits, lack of support, which have had a very negative effect on people's mental health and cognition, including obviously people with dementia. So there's increasing science, facts and evidence showing that the very things that have been done, that have been led by the science, are actually having a detrimental effect on people's lives, particularly those of people living in care homes. And I think James already has said, as have others, the decisions around hospital admissions, treatment, discharge for older people, many of whom had dementia, clearly violated, in many cases, their legal rights, their human rights. And in that desire to protect the NHS, actually lives were being sacrificed. There's 25,000 people, 26,000 people were discharged to care homes, and there are numerous examples of either being untested or tested, and those discharges resulting in outbreaks of COVID and deaths. So actually, we've been sacrificing lives and violating the right to life in other public policy measures to protect the NHS. And that's a controversial thing to say. decisions, I'm sure a lot of the time, were made with the best intent, but actually 20% of all deaths have occurred in care homes. How come that's happened, and what's the impact been on people with dementia? Well, it's been a very detrimental and frightening impact for people still alive. So just my final slide, please, and then I'll wind up. So thank you for bearing with me, including Philly. So I wanted to end on a positive note in these times of COVID. It's slightly difficult to do, but I think there are some positives we can draw and look forward to, not only those that I mentioned, I guess, but also people are talking about how can we start building reconnections post-COVID. What do we need to do that across populations, generations, across disability groups? The way care and support has been provided has shown some ways new and innovative examples. Digital inclusion, yes, of course, many people, older people and people with dementia, can't use technology, but actually sometimes they have the technology but haven't been able to understand how to use it, and there have been examples of helping people to become digitally included. So there are some positives, and I'd recommend this report to you, produced by the Long-Term Care Policy Networks based at the LSE and UCL, which has some hard-hitting facts about dementia and some good recommendations, but some good examples from different countries of how COVID's been responded to. And of course, the work of the Alzheimer's Society, Dementia UK, the Ideal Research Project produced some really good leaflets, which members of the panel contributed to. The Race Equality Foundation's produced good resources for people from Black, Asian, minority ethnic communities affected by dementia. Innovations in Dementia, Deep, Tide, Carers Networks have all been working hard to produce good information. So just to conclude, well, what do those three key principles of the manifesto tell us? Remembering dementia as humanity, so remembering that a disease is about people, not just the pathology, the epidemiology of a disease. So yes, we should follow the science, but we should also listen to what people say who are experiencing disease, caring for someone with disease, whether it's dementia or COVID. And dementia as disease and disability, I think Julian put this very well, and it is a positive model of disability, the social model of disability, saying what should society do to support people with dementia and enable their participation, and Julian gave examples of that. And a key one is about hearing that voice of people with dementia, that their voice is heard, as we've heard from Jane and Keith, and hear from many other people with dementia elsewhere about what their experience is. So when we think about dementia, values-based practice and rights, we can say, yes, of course, there's evidence there around what is good to protect people, but there's also evidence coming from people with dementia who may be saying, I want to see my loved ones, I want to connect, I may live in a care home, but I need to have that connection. Otherwise, things will get really bad for me, even if I'm in an infection-controlled environment and safe from COVID. So perhaps that's the thing that I would want to end on, about saying, let's hear more from the voice of people with dementia and other disabilities coming together in common cause. Perhaps there should be an advisory group of people with lived experiences, advising SAGE with the science, because it's about their values, what they're saying. This is our experience. It's not just about the science in a traditional way, but it's about qualitative experience, the facts that are brought together. Because if this carries on much longer in the way it's carried on so far, I don't want that to happen. I want to see a different approach taken, and I think the voice of people with lived experience is crucial in that. Okay, thank you for allowing me that extra time, Philly, and I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Toby. I couldn't have stopped you anyway, because I was completely fascinated by that presentation, and so much to think about there. And I particularly like your suggestion at the end that there should be this advisory group for SAGE, and maybe some of us can get together and put that proposal to them. So thank you very much, and to all our speakers. So Toby was our last speaker. So now we've got a nice lot of time for discussion, and the questions are starting to flow in. Thank you very much. Could I invite all our speakers, panelists, to come back on, unmute yourselves, put yourselves on video so we can see you all. And can I remind those of you who are watching on YouTube that you can leave your comments on YouTube as well. They will be transferred to our chat box as well. Okay, so what I suggest is that we don't all try to answer each question, otherwise we'll probably only get through one question. So what I'd like you to do when I read out the question is indicate if you'd like to answer, and I'm just going to pick two of you. If you desperately want to answer it, wave madly and I'll try and try and make sure you do that. So the first question that I'm going to is one from Holly Marland. Hopefully Holly is still here. She says, I'm interested in values-based practice in relation to people from different ethnic backgrounds. Sometimes where there's no word for dementia and specific cultural stigmas and also some reticence in getting vaccinated. Was the Dementia Manifesto informed by the lived experience from people from different cultures? So given that specifically about the Dementia Manifesto, I think those are questions, that's a question probably for you, Toby, and you, Julian, if you fancy answering that.
Well, I'm happy to kick off, and maybe Julian's got something to say as well. We did, in fact, we did get the drafts of the book reviewed by various people we know, including people here on the panel. I don't think it was specifically informed by someone, people from Black, Asian and minority ethnic communities. So I think that's something we would want to think about if we ever do a revision. We do talk about some of the issues affecting people from Black, Asian, minority ethnic communities affected by dementia, and some of the nuances and differences, including language and culture, that might generate, because clearly those are central to understanding a person's values and understanding cultural values and community values as well. And I suppose the other thing is, I'd say there's someone called David Trustwell who published a book at the beginning of this year about very much on a similar theme about thinking around good care, but also bringing in values around working with people from Black, Asian, minority ethnic communities affected by dementia. So I think it's, 5 years ago, it wasn't a topic that was discussed a great deal. And now it's really, when we were first writing the book, and I think in the course of writing the book, it's become something that people are much more acutely aware of, and particularly because of the impact of COVID. And yeah, I'll just encourage a lot more discussion, and I hope to see more papers and reports on that particular issue. Don't know, Julian, do you want to add anything to that?
I don't want to add much, just to say that I know that there are groups who are really looking into these issues to do with Black and ethnic minorities. I mean, for instance, the group in Bradford, I know that they were putting in funding bids, and it is obviously a big issue that does need to be looked at in more detail. There is some research on it, and but I don't think we got into that research in our book, although, as Toby said, we did touch on some of these issues.
Okay, thanks, Julian, and thanks, Holly, for raising that question, very important one. I'm going to come now to Kate White, who says, can the panel comment on how they feel the rights of people living with a dementia, which are so closely linked to the rights both of paid and unpaid carers, how can those rights be met without a major political campaign regarding the financial resources needed for a totally reformed social care system? What might be our next steps? So this is a huge question. I'm just going to take two of you. Who's keen? Keith, thank you.
Well, the first answer is it can't be. That's the straight answer. And if I was a politician, I probably wouldn't give that answer. I'd fudge and riddle and say all sorts of rubbish, but it can't be. It's got to be a fundamental change. And I was reading in yesterday's paper a quote from Barbara Windsor's husband, where he was expressing his frustration that changes that the government had promised in their manifesto prior to the election weren't forthcoming. It will be interesting to see when the pandemic begins to abate and we move on to actual more domestic policies, what will be forthcoming, because we will have a window of opportunity. And I think we've really got to grab that. When things start to move forward, we've really got to be in there at the front of this queue, because it's desperate that the needs of people with dementia and carers are met through this.
Thanks, Keith. Toby.
Actually, I think Jane just put her hand up, so I'll defer to Jane.
Sorry, I missed that. Sorry, we'll defer to Jane then.
No, it's simultaneous. Anyway, I'm just going to say, I don't believe we can wait for policy to change and all that. We should concentrate on education, educate the people, everybody. Educate me in what it means to be a carer, educate Chris in alluded to the fact that we're using the word dementia, but we do know there are different types. But for a discussion such as this, we're having to use the word dementia because there are too many diseases to name individually. But we need to educate the staff, but we need to educate us all in what our rights are, in what we can expect from the condition. Don't tell us that Chris definitely will die with dementia, but because of dementia. My mum died very peacefully as she could. It wasn't a dreadful death, at home with her family, because we were able to keep her at home. And this is one of the massive things that's been highlighted with the pandemic. That isn't happening because of the enforced isolations. I think we're naive if we're going to get policy changed in this small window, but if we can educate everybody in what our rights are, then we can insist on it, and it will hopefully change almost like, I don't know the correct word, osmosis or by usage. It will change by usage, by us insisting on our rights, on having what is ours by legislation. Then that will create a change at grassroots level, which is exactly where we need it. We need it now, we can't wait.
Thank you, Jane. So it's knowledge and education. Thank you. Toby, did you want to come in on this?
Really just to add to what Keith and Jane have said, I agree with Keith. I think maybe at some points there will be a window of opportunity around how we think about sort of paying for the pandemic, and the fact that the care sector, the social care sector, has been very much under the spotlight, often for very upsetting and distressing reasons. But that might provide an opportunity to change how social care is provided and funded. So that's one thought. But I also think back to 2013-14, where with virtually no exceptions, no one was talking about rights and dementia. And I know there were people who published a few things, but in terms of a narrative, I wasn't aware of it. And I've got to hand it to Chris Roberts. I remember going and hearing Chris speak, and for the first time I heard someone with dementia say, "These are my rights, I have a disability." And that was, thank you so much, Chris, because that opened my eyes to suddenly, gosh, why aren't we talking about it in terms of disability? And Steve at Innovations and Dementia was another one, obviously you, Philly, and other people as well. And that made me think we should do something about this. And obviously I was in a position at the Mental Health Foundation with support from the Joseph Rowntree Foundation to publish a report. But no, it was only a report. But it was suddenly seemed to coalesce, and other people were talking about rights at the same time. So quite quickly, it shifted into a narrative where people are really talking about rights in relation to dementia. Many people are talking about it in terms of disability rights as well. And that wasn't a big orchestrated political campaign. That was sort of serendipity, but because of activists and supporters, and I obviously count myself as a supporter, but crucially, the activists were people like Chris and Jane and Keith and other people with dementia who had their voice heard, who banged on about this issue and prepared to go to Geneva and so on. And suddenly, when people with lived experience are talking about this, that's when politicians do really listen and the media listens, whatever the rights and wrongs of that as a response. So I think you can achieve quite a lot with quite limited resources and serendipity and commitment.
Thanks, Toby. Keith, just a very quick answer before we move on to the next question.
Yeah,
please.
just literally very quick, 2 sentences, Philly. And it links in what Toby's just been saying about the UN and Geneva, where Philly will remember back, because the United Nations said to me, and supported by Philly and my wife, you've got the tools in Britain, use them. There are other things there. And they really issued the challenge back to us. And when we were followed up by the government going and being grilled by the UN, they really did give our government a grilling. And part of that, I think, was based upon the foundations that we'd laid a couple of weeks before. So we've got to do more of that, I think.
Thanks, Keith. That's a really good point. Whenever you mention our trip to Geneva, right, I have this shudder of horror, because we had such problems getting into the building. They wouldn't let Rosemary in. And I think we thought at one point we were just going to have to turn around and go home again. But we managed it, didn't we, Keith? Okay, and we've got lots of questions coming in now. Some of them are very long, I have to say. And if I actually read them out, that would probably take the rest of the time. They're more like theses than questions. So can I suggest that you keep your question to like 10 words or something like they do on Question Time on the BBC, and then they're more likely to get read out. So we've got a lovely question from Chris Wall here, which has come via YouTube. Chris says, with regards to invoking change, is it time to merge and collaborate on the issue more as a united front? Or do we continue as expanding separate entities with the same aim? Yeah, that's a good question, Chris. I would just like to let you, those of you know who might not know already, that some of the bigger dementia organisations and the smaller ones like us have recently formed an informal network called One Dementia Voice, which is a fantastic move forward, I think, in terms of collaboration, trying to work together rather than what sometimes happened in the past, competing or at least not supporting each other. So hopefully that's good news. But would any of our panel like to say something about the importance of collaboration on the issue of rights and values? Toby.
Yeah, well, the short answer is yes, but I think beyond just dementia. Think about building coalitions. We should think about building coalitions with other disability groups. It was a disability rights movement that, first of all, campaigned so effectively for what was then the Disability Discrimination Act, which is now part of the Equality Act. And that was effective because they weren't campaigning as a single diagnostic group. They were campaigning within that kind of framework of the social model of disability. And I think that's where I also want to say is be wary of our Human Rights Act, because it still uses the term unsound mind. It still is based upon diagnostic categories. Well, unsound mind is not a diagnosis, quite clearly. It's a rather archaic term to describe people who have a mental health condition or a learning disability or dementia. Think of the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. Have a look at it. It's good, it's powerful, and it gets away from diagnosis. It says it doesn't matter what your diagnosis is, you may experience impairments, and those impairments are perceived by society in negative ways. We need to change society to be inclusive, to enable us to participate as equal citizens. And that's where you get alliances across disability groups, which can campaign really effectively. And the CRPD is a much better legal framework, in my view, has both positive and negative rights than our Human Rights Act. But I'm not saying abolish the Human Rights Act, because I don't want to go down that route either, because that's a reactionary position I don't hold to. Thanks.
Thank you, Toby. And Jane?
There should be collaboration. Chris has just been saying to me, in the 80s, the disability movement came up with the nothing about us without us. But with dementia, it definitely is nothing about us without all of us. None of us can do this on our own. The people, the carer and the person with dementia, the social help that we get. But the point I wanted to make was that actually on the ground, those of us living at home, we don't care who does it. We want you all to work together. You should all be working for us. You have a commitment to support the people at grassroots level. And we don't care what alliances there are, but we do care if you're bitching and fighting, and that is taking up scarce resources that could go to support people like Keith, myself, Chris, on the ground. So we are extremely delighted that there is this collaboration going on. It's been a long time coming, but you're all coming from the right place. There's no need to argue between, or fight for your own resources. Make sure your resources filter down and affect the people like us at grassroots level, because that's where it really matters. That's what makes the difference in our lives.
Thanks, Jane. Powerful stuff. I go to Keith and then to Danny.
Yes, and just briefly again, just to go back to the dementia statements, and whatever collaboration does take place, use them as one of the levers or the tools to move things forward, because the word "we" is the most pluralistic word you can think of. For sure, it's the carer, the person with dementia, but it is more than that. It is the professionals as well, I suggest, who are working alongside us, because they have rights as well, and their rights are our rights as well, because they want to get the best for us.
Thanks, Keith. Danny.
Yeah, so I just wanted to sort of acknowledge, I guess, some of the work that's already being done as well. Obviously, just within sort of local communities and things like that, our dementia activist group in the local area have worked with so many different sort of companies to give them the education that actually dementia happens at a much younger age for some people. So, you know, the age range on that group hasn't worked to allow everyone to access it and have everyone to have the right to attend that group. And they also work in places like, you know, gyms where the lighting can be quite dull or it's inaccessible for people with dementia. So it's quite nice to see that actually some of that collaborative working is already taking place, but in small forms in local communities. So, yeah.
Thank you very much. Okay, I'm going to read out a comment that's come through from one of our listeners, and just in case any of you would like to comment on that as well. They say, encouraging advanced statements or discussions for us all is important. Our values when well might be different if we consider how we'd like to be treated when we have a condition like dementia, which might impair one's understanding. The truth-telling value might not be applicable and valid in all circumstances. That's quite complicated, but certainly in terms of, would any of you like to raise the issue about advanced statements? Right, Jane and then Keith.
Whilst I agree that when you're well, what you decide then may be different for when you're actually going into that stage, but it's important to actually address and review your advanced statements regularly. Chris changed his advanced statement at the point of COVID. We went into lockdown, there was fear, there was anxiety, lockdown, no ventilators, and Chris and I had the discussion. Chris has a lung disease, COPD, and Chris said, I don't want treatment. I do not want to go into hospital and take up a ventilator that could be for somebody else. That was his choice. However, 3-4 months down the line, we found out that ventilators weren't the life-saving machine we thought they were, and that people did better on the CPAP and the oxygen therapy. And Chris said, well, now, yes, I would, if I developed COVID, I would go into hospital for the CPAP, for the oxygen therapy, but not still. His decision was not to take a ventilator up. So it's important that we actually address these things and change our mind, because 10 years ago, Chris may well have said, no, that's it, give me complete life-saving treatment. As we progress, our values, they all change. They change at the time, and we have to take those values at that point in time and try to keep things as updated as possible for as long as possible.
Thank you, Jane.
Yeah,
Keith.
just to sort of endorse what Jane has just said. Prior to this conference today, I was at another conference speaking, and this question was asked of me actually, and I drew a line alongside it with the truth inquiry and signposted people to that, because I did an advance directive when first diagnosed, and when we did our power of attorney. And the GP was very, very, very anti it and really tried hard to persuade Rosemary and I against the idea. He didn't succeed, but that was an interesting perspective from someone who was charged with caring for me and caring for us. But then just to link into the truth statement that the questioner made, I'm a fabulous believer, 100%, in compassionate truths. I'm not a believer in compassionate lies. And there is a difference. And you, Philly, and Toby and Julian were part of the truth inquiry with me a few years ago. And the report, I do commend it to people, published by the Mental Health Foundation, because it's excellent. And what I want to see is professionals who are trained not to tell better lies, but to tell better truths. And I feel my rights and my values are really so ingrained within me, and they're based upon truth. I don't want to be lied to. We see that so much in politicians, and then it builds mistrust. It builds breakdown of relationships. It builds a breakdown of trust. Because even when people get to the later stages, as my mother was, there were still glimmers of lucidity. And in those moments of lucidity, and you didn't know when they were coming, she knew full well whether she was being lied to or not. And so the best way is really treat people with respect and treat people honestly and fairly. They're the fundamental values and rights. And part of that is to treat them truthfully with compassionate truths, not brutal truths. Because if you treat people with brutal truths, as Maya Angelou said, people will forget the truth or the honesty and they'll remember the brutality.
Thank you, Keith. Julian. Can you unmute yourself, please?
I just wanted to respond to that specific question because, and really just to make a sort of a slightly mundane legal point, which is that I think the question was about putting in a sort of an advanced statement that you do or don't want to be treated truthfully or told the truth. But of course, we just need to be careful that we're not talking about advanced decisions to refuse treatment. So that's the only thing that would be legally binding, and that wouldn't be relevant, I don't think, to this question of whether you want people to tell you the truth or not. Of course, any of us can write an advanced statement, but that doesn't have that kind of legally binding quality. What that does is shows that those are our wishes, and anybody then making decisions for us must do so in our best interests, and that means they should look at that statement and try to abide by it. But of course, then we get into a big discussion about best interests, and I think what Keith just said so wonderfully is absolutely pertinent, that you've got to take a very full view and really understand the person and what made that person tick and what were that person's underlying values and wishes and so forth. So it's a rather kind of complicated question, I think.
I think all these questions are quite complicated. We could spend a day talking about each one, couldn't we? But that's what's so fascinating about the subject. Okay, I've got another question, which I'm going to try and précis. Much of the language used by service providers, for example, in health and social care, is couched in terms of eligibility or needs. How important is it that we try and shift our language to the language of rights and values, and what could or might this achieve?
Well, I'll just start off with a quick one. In the Welsh legislation, Social Services and Wellbeing Wales Act, it says that the person, regardless of dementia, the person with the needs must be offered direct payments. That doesn't happen because the staff implementing that legislation don't understand the legislation, don't understand that word. And very often people's rights are ignored because the person not imposing, the person proffering, the person in charge of that particular right doesn't know about it. So again, it's down to legislation. Well, that's just the only example I can think of.
Thanks, Jane. Toby, I thought you might have something to say about this.
Well, I suppose, eligibility and needs are particularly relate to the social care system. In a way, they don't relate so closely to a healthcare system, because at the moment we still normally have a healthcare system which is free at the point of need. You can present at any time to a GP or hospital and you get free treatment or free assessment, whereas obviously social care is conditional, and those are our rights really, but the rights are quite limited because of financial eligibility and severity of need. So in order to change that, and I wonder whether that language can be changed in more positive ways to to make it feel it's not meant to be gatekeeping. It's just meant to be trying to prioritise those people whose needs are greatest, given the limited amount of resources that local authorities have. But then there's another debate about National Care Service and so on. What else was going to say? So that's, it's difficult to know how you can marry up the two different kinds of language. Although one thing I would say that in the Care Act, which was passed in 2014, and I think for England, I think it's similar in Wales and possibly also in Scotland, there is a central principle, and that principle is of well-being. So it's a very clearly stated value that everything that should be done under the Care Act must be done with the aim of enhancing the well-being of the person receiving the service. And I think that kind of extends to family carers as well. So for example, going back to the issue about truth-telling, now, is this going to enhance or improve their well-being, or is it going to be detrimental? So I think, in a way, there is a value that's been placed there at the centre of the Care Act. You could also say that notion of unwise decisions not being proof that someone lacks capacity, as a principle in the Mental Capacity Act, that's another a value. And certainly how you say what's an unwise decision, well, that's opens up a whole Pandora's box of values. So although values aren't necessarily explicitly stated as values, when you unpick legislation, you can sometimes see them actually there right at the centre of legislation. And I think that can be used in a constructive way to say, well, how can we use this in a way that's supportive to people, that improves quality of life in the absence of effective treatments? Isn't just something we say that's too complicated to deal with, or in the worst case scenario we use to say, well, we don't like what they're doing, so we'll call it unwise. But it should be done in an empowering way, and a way that I think was done in the spirit of how the legislation was written.
Jane.
I'm going to take issue with Toby there, if I dare. Yes, the values are written into the Act. In the Wales, they have the "what matters to me" sentence, which is what every social services should be using, the "what matters to me" question. But it's that erosion of the rights. You said that the resources are limited to the prioritisation. That prioritisation goes against the legislation. Now, I do understand that, yes, they've only got a set amount of money, but why should we not be able to access something because somebody else has access more? That is not our problem. That is a problem that you go back to the policy and the financial situation to sort out. So this is where those of us at grassroots level have this dichotomy, anomaly, whatever it is. You say I'm eligible for it, but you won't give it to me because somebody is more eligible. That's where those grassroots have the difficulty. I don't know the answer.
I'm not going to let Toby come back, but thank you. That's a great point. Keith, and then Julian, were you wanting to say something as well? Just go to Keith first.
Just briefly, what's going through my mind is three eligibilities. One is an eligibility and a right to education. And that is firmly based in our society. And although homeschooling is causing all sorts of problems, fundamentally and normally, kids are in school and youngsters have access to further education and higher education if they require it, wish it, and qualify for it. Secondly, access to and eligibility to the NHS and free medical care. It's a given, it's a right. The third element of this mix is missing, and that is the freedom to or access to freely social care. To me, that's the triad of our society. And one element is missing, and it should certainly not be missing. And I think today's wonderful conference is going to form part of the movement towards achieving that.
Thank you, Keith. Julian.
It was just a quick comment from a very kind of medical perspective, but the General Medical Council just a few months ago brought out a new guidance for doctors about consent. And one of the things to note in that is that it quite often talks overtly about values and about the doctor understanding the values of the person. And it does this specifically in the section that's to do with people who are not able to consent themselves, who lack the capacity to consent. And part of the basis of that was a big influence on that new guidance was the well-known Montgomery legal case. And one of the things that the judges said in that was that what we need when we're talking about consent is adult-to-adult conversations. And so, so it's all very well that it's there in that guidance, but of course we then need a lot of education of doctors to make sure that they kind of understand that, and they understand how to have adult-to-adult conversations, and they understand how to elicit people's values and so forth. And also, also education of lay people to know that they've got those rights to go to the doctor and say, well, you've got to listen to my values. This is important. In fact, it's in your General Medical Council guidance that you've got to pay attention to my values.
Thanks, Julian. Okay, we've just got time for one final question before we wind up. My brain is buzzing with all sorts of ideas, questions, thoughts, and I hope that that applies to all of you who are listening as well. So the final question is from Kate Harwood, and she says, a lot of our discussion assumes that the person with dementia has a carer or family friend support. What kind of support is there or should there be available for people who live on their own? Presumably support to achieve their rights. Jane.
I'll come in just because I can tell you what's going on in North Wales. When somebody gets a diagnosis, and we were involved in the commissioning and specifically requested this, they are assigned a dementia support worker, not from the usual suspects. It's a very small local charity affiliated to a larger one, not Alzheimer's Society, and they contact the person, whoever, whether they've got a carer or not, but this is particularly important for those living on their own without a family carer, without a neighbour. They make contact, they go, they explain what is available, and they keep that contact going. If the person initially refuses, they make contact within the first week, they then make contact within a month, they then make contact within 3 months. After that, a letter goes out, but they do not lose touch with that person. And that person, when that person is ready, has that contact. It's proactive contact, not reactionary, because reactionary is too late. It needs to be proactive. That's a service we've set up in this area for everybody with a diagnosis of dementia, but massively important for those who have no Jane or Rosemary to be there on their side. That's what we do in North Wales.
Thanks, Jane. Anybody else like to have a final thought about that, people who are living on their own? Toby.
I mean, yes, I agree with Jane, and where that service is available, that's fantastic. Obviously, it does require the person to get a diagnosis in the first place. And I think maybe it goes back to a more general sort of awareness around dementia and the way dementia is talked about, the values that underpin the sort of public narratives and media narratives. Make it something that's not to be frightened of, not to be ashamed of. It reduces stigma. We've talked a lot about this in lots of other places around reducing stigma. So if someone is worried about what's going on with their memory, their communication, their cognition, and think this may be dementia, they're not fearful of coming forward and saying, I've got this problem and where can I get help from? And the response is helpful and supportive, whether or not they live alone or with other people. And that information is available out there. And the reaction of society, the community they live in, is a supportive one, not one that ostracizes them or makes them feel that they're too frightened to ever leave the house again, kind of thing. And it's a big ask. I know things have changed to some extent. The diagnosis rates have gone up, and there are more people who think much more positively around dementia and respond more positively, and that's a sign of what's happened over the last 10, 15 years. So things are changing, but no, it's still a real struggle for many others.
Thank you very much, Toby. So 2 hours have absolutely whizzed by. I can't believe we've come to the end already. Thank you so much to all of you who've been taking part. I've been keeping half an eye on the chat box, or a quarter of an eye, and I know that lots of people have been making comments and others have been replying to them. or sending them links, which is absolutely fantastic. So there's been this kind of parallel dialogue going on. Thank you all very much for that. The slides and the film of the event will be sent to all of those of you who have signed up. So please look out for that. I'd like to say a massive thank you to all our panelists stroke speakers who've been absolutely brilliant and have provoked us all into thinking through these very complicated and challenging but very, very important issues, particularly at this time. Without more ado, I'd just like to pass over to Bill Fulford, who'd like to say a goodbye from our hosts. Bill.
Thank you very much, Philly. I'm speaking because Ashok, who welcomed you all from the Collaborating Centre, has been called off on surgical duties. So he's passed the baton back to me. As Ashok said, we run the centre between us. Philly, can I add to your thanks? A huge thank you to you for such wonderful chairing of this meeting. And also I'd like to thank Mihir Sheth and Matthew Ellicott, who Matthew in behind the scenes and Mihir now helping us today, have really helped to make this session work so wonderfully. You can have the best panelists, the best participants, the best discussion. If the technology doesn't work, then nothing works. So thank you, Mihir.
So true.
Could I just like to pick up on one point that you may want to carry forward. Julian mentioned the Montgomery ruling, and I know there's a lot of people here who perhaps know more about this than I do, but we've been particularly interested in this in the Collaborating Centre. It does talk about conversation, it does talk about dialogue. This is a lesson that I and others in my profession with my medical hat on should pay more attention to. It also talks quite explicitly about that dialogue encompassing values as well as evidence. And by values, the Montgomery ruling, even more clearly, I think, the GMC guidance is about our values as individuals. It's what's important to that patient, to that carer as an individual. I think that theme has come through very strongly in the webinar today. And so thank you, Julian, for mentioning Montgomery. If any of you are brave enough to read the whole judgment, it's available still, and it's worth reading, particularly Baroness Hale's minority ruling, which comes in the last few paragraphs, where she makes these issues in her inimicable way very transparent. So thank you for a marvelous seminar, and thank you, Julian and Toby, again for your Dementia Manifesto. It was hugely exciting when you first published it. It's hugely relevant today. Thank you very much, everybody. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Bill. And thank you, everyone, and goodbye.